Deadly chemicals are said to be raining down from the sky, wreaking havoc on the health of the population and planet. Who is spraying this poison into the clouds? And perhaps more importantly, why? As you watch a plane take off, soar through the sky, or touch down to land, what do you think of? For some people, airplanes bring to mind thoughts and visions of travel, perhaps for vacation or recreational purposes, or possibly even for work. For others, jet planes may conjure up feelings of adventure or freedom, while for others still, watching or imagining a jet soar through the sky may elicit feelings of anxiety or even terror, possibly due to a bad experience or a deep-seated fear of flying. What about images of war and destruction? It's impossible to imagine modern warfare without thinking about fighter jets and bombers, drones and missiles. While all of these thoughts are reasonably linked to modern aviation, there are many people, up to 20% of the population according to some studies, for whom watching a jet tear through the sky brings to mind things even more terrifying, even more sinister than war. These individuals believe that the visible trails of exhaust and condensation sometimes seen in the wake of jet engines are not condensation trails or contrails at all. They are utterly convinced that these artificial clouds, which sometimes linger for extended periods of time, are in fact chemical trails, or chemtrails. While the exact chemical makeup of these trails, the purpose for the introduction of those chemicals into the environment, and the identities and motives of those behind this atrocity vary, depending on whom you ask. The chemtrail theory has a relatively long history and brings a lot to be unpacked. Let's first examine the mainstream explanation for those trails in the sky. Condensation trails, or contrails for short, are made up of water vapor emitted as exhaust from jet engines. Jet engines are a type of combustion engine, and it is widely known that combustion engines emit exhaust primarily composed of water vapor and CO2. The water vapor released from a jet engine at high altitude rapidly forms ice crystals in the sub-zero temperatures at such altitudes, which in turn form line-shaped clouds, or condensation trails. The length of time these trails persist can vary widely based on atmospheric conditions, including pressure, temperature, and humidity. And while this sounds like a completely reasonable, scientific explanation, proponents of the chemtrails theory claim the vapor trails witnessed in the wake of jet aircraft are made up of some combination of the following: aluminum salts, barium, thorium, strontium, polymer fibers, and silicon carbide. Let's take a closer look at some of these compounds and their potential effects. Aluminum, element 13 of the periodic table, which viewers are no doubt familiar with in the form of beverage containers, foil, and countless other products and applications, is a lightweight silvery white metal. It is roughly 1/3 the density of iron, and is the most abundant non-ferrous metal on planet Earth. In its pure form, it is known to be non-toxic, though some disputed studies have found that extremely high concentrations, it may cause Alzheimer's disease. Certain aluminum salts, which chemtrail proponents claim are being dispersed, can have harmful effects on humans and animals if exposed to them in sufficient quantity. These effects are said to include confusion, seizures, bone pain, deformities, neurotoxicity, rare forms of anemia, and breast cancer. Barium, element 56 of the periodic table, is a soft, silvery, alkali earth metal, which is so highly reactive that it is never found in nature as a free element. One of its compounds, barium sulfate, is used by doctors to help examine the esophagus and GI tract with X-rays and CT scans. Other barium compounds, however, are dangerous. Some barium compounds, including barium carbonate, which is used in rat poison, can be extremely harmful to humans, causing cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, as well as irregular cardiac function or cardiac failure, as well as respiratory failure. Our research indicates that barium has not been evaluated by the EPA as a possible carcinogen. Thorium, element 90 of the periodic table, is a moderately hard silvery metal which tarnishes black when exposed to air. It is also radioactive. It is used in electric equipment, glass, the lenses of cameras and microscopes, and for nuclear energy. It can be stored in the bones of the body for many years after exposure, and can lead to lung cancer, as well as pancreatic cancer. It can also cause neurotoxicity due to metal poisoning. Synthetic polymer fibers are often made from petrochemicals and are ever present in our daily lives. Look around, and you will see that polymers are everywhere, as anything made from plastic is made from polymers. They are also used in fabrics, glue, paint, and a near infinite number of other things. If it is made by humans, it almost certainly contains synthetic polymers. These microscopic fibers are relatively stable until they are cut, crushed, burned, or otherwise mutilated, in which case they release harmful dust and vapors, which cause nearly every form of cancer, many neurological conditions, lung disease, and widespread pollution. Silicon carbide is a compound composed of silica and carbon. It occurs naturally as an extremely rare mineral called moissanite, which has recently come into fashion in the jewelry industry as a substitute for diamonds. It has been mass-produced in synthetic form since at least 1893 for many uses, including as an abrasive. One example of this would be sandpaper. Repeated exposure to silicon carbide dust is known to cause chronic lung disease, which can be fatal. In addition to the toxic substances already discussed, some chemtrail believers also claim the vapor trails to be made up of various biological agents such as viruses, bacteria, or nerve gas. If the airborne trails left in the wake of jet aircraft are indeed spreading any of these toxic chemicals to the population, it is extremely alarming. Who is behind this sinister plot to poison the population? What shadowy figures could be pulling the strings and raining down hell on Earth? The answer to this is generally vague, and it varies depending on who is answering the question. At the top of the list are the usual suspects in the government: the deep state bureaucracy, the CIA, NSA, FDA, or even NASA, the UN, NATO, or some other conglomeration of world powers. At least some elements within the military, the United States Air Force, or the Navy, for example, would certainly be involved. Academia would have to be complicit, along with some of the largest corporations and industrialists. The most likely scenario would be some combination of these various groups, or at least a significant number of key individuals within each. The next question we have to ask is why? For what purpose are these harmful chemicals being introduced into our environment? There are a number of motives put forth by subscribers to the chemtrail theory. One such motive is profit. For instance, what if the yields or quality of crops were being affected by these chemtrails? If this were the case, futures markets could be manipulated by whoever's behind the phenomenon. Having insider knowledge of a coming surplus or famine before it occurs would be like printing money. Purposely making people sick to benefit the pharmaceutical industry would be another prime example of the profit motive. It is widely acknowledged that Western medicine places its focus on treating diseases and their symptoms with prescription drugs rather than focusing on preventive care. The pharmaceutical industry at large is worth an estimated $1.3 trillion in 2019 alone, and was the highest spending sector in terms of lobbying dollars given to members of the United States government that year, to the tune of $295 million. On a skeptical note, it must be pointed out that the federal government of the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world has no shortage of money. However, can the same be said for all of the individual politicians and bureaucrats that wield the power of that government? How many key individuals within government the military, and the capital would need to be bribed or otherwise compromised in order to pull off such a conspiracy and keep it quiet. Greed is certainly one of the oldest and most common motives for any type of malevolent behavior. Another motive put forth by chemtrail believers is population control. In 1900, the world population numbered roughly 1.6 billion people. Today, that figure stands at just under 8 billion, and while population growth is slowing, it is projected to reach 11 billion by the year 2100. The planet possesses finite resources, such as minerals, fossil fuels, land, fresh water, food, and even clean air. With more people to share a dwindling amount of resources, the result could be widespread poverty, famine, disease, war, suffering, and death on a global scale, the likes of which the human race has never seen. Is it possible that some group of elite individuals has decided to reduce the population of the Earth to a smaller, more manageable size? If the perpetrators of this conspiracy decided to reduce the number of humans on the planet, their options would be to cull some of the population, reduce the life expectancy, lower the birth rate, or manipulate the food supply. Any or all of these methods could be quite effective. Could chemtrails be used to further this goal? But why would any government want to kill its own citizens in any substantial number? After all, what is power without a population to rule over? There would be fewer workers to maintain essential services and infrastructure, less tax revenue, and fewer citizens to serve in the armed forces to protect and further the nation's interests. A research paper originating from staff members at Stanford University states, quote, "Any population control mechanism degrades the value of human life and is therefore unacceptable." It is safe to say that academia would not be on board with this motive. While it is hard to believe that any government would take this course of action on a large scale, population control is not unprecedented. The 20th century witnessed the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis, which claimed the lives of at least 6 million. The government of Turkey killed somewhere between 3.5 and 4.3 million Armenians, Christians, and other non-Muslims from 1900 to 1923. The policies of Joseph Stalin were responsible for at least 9 million deaths in the Soviet Union. The death toll under Cambodian dictator Pol Pot is estimated at somewhere between 1.2 and 2.8 million, which was around 30% of that country's population at the time. A bit more recently, China had the infamous one-child policy from 1979 to the present, though most rural families were allowed to have 2 children. This was an attempt to curb population growth. In order to enforce this policy, China issued enormous fines for people who broke the rule, as well as using compulsory contraception, abortion, and even forced sterilization. Physically taking away people's ability to have children didn't just happen in China, however. 400,000 people were sterilized in Nazi Germany, and between 1907 to 1963, 64,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States. Yet another possible motive advanced by chemtrail theory adherents is mind control. Governments have sought to control the thoughts and therefore behavior of their citizens through widespread use of propaganda and disinformation for centuries, if not longer. Corporations have long sought to influence people with persuasive advertising and even subliminal messaging. Could chemtrails be used for these purposes? To most of us, mind control may sound like something out of a science fiction film, but certain elements within the United States government, namely the CIA, were highly interested in developing and testing mind control tactics. To that end, the CIA created a secret project, codenamed MKUltra. The project was started in 1953 and continued for decades, using various methods to manipulate the mental state and brain functions of its test subjects, many, if not most of whom, were unwilling participants. The subjects were exposed to high doses of LSD and then made to endure hypnosis, electroshock therapy, extreme isolation, and sensory deprivation. They were then observed and interrogated, while also being abused verbally, physically, and in some cases, sexually. These illegal experiments were carried out in at least 80 facilities around the world on American and Canadian citizens, as well as foreign nationals suspected of being spies, and anybody else the CIA deemed to be expendable. When the project was ended in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all documents related to the project. Fortunately, some 20,000 pages escaped the document shredder, some of which were eventually declassified. Many chemtrail theorists believe the military is engaging in some sort of secret weapons program, knowingly dispersing harmful chemicals or biological agents onto the population in order to gather data and test the effectiveness of such weapons. Could there be any truth to this? Is it plausible that the military would test biological weapons on civilians of its own country? In September of 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted a secret mission called Operation Sea Spray. Over the course of 6 days, a minesweeper sprayed a rare bacteria into the Bay Area fog of San Francisco from approximately 2 miles off the coast. The Navy estimated, based on data from monitoring equipment set up around the city before the experiment, that enough bacteria had been dispersed for each of the 800,000 residents of San Francisco to have inhaled at least 5,000 particles. The Navy didn't bother to alert healthcare professionals prior to, or even after the operation, as it would have compromised their data. 11 people were hospitalized with rare infections, all testing positive for the bacteria which had been sprayed. One man even died. As of 1970, a total of at least 239 such tests had been carried out all over the country, including Florida, New York, Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania, among other places. In 80 of those tests, live bacteria were used. In at least one instance, in Minnesota, zinc cadmium sulfate was sprayed, which is now known to cause cancer. Weather control is another proposed motive for chemtrails. Whether used for altruistic or even malevolent purposes, it is easy to imagine the allure of controlling the weather. If this technology exists, and the weather could be harnessed, the possibilities are staggering. Hurricanes and other storms could be steered away from vulnerable coastal communities. Rainfall could be manipulated to mitigate the effect of droughts. Conversely, the weather could be used as a weapon. While this might sound even more like science fiction than the concept of mind control, there may be some substance to this notion. Chemtrail theorists point to a United States Air Force report from 1996 titled "Owning the Weather by 2025" as one clue that may point to military involvement in a conspiracy. The report details activities such as, quote, aerial obscuration, conducted by, quote, weather force specialists. United States Air Force Colonel Walter Washbaugh, in a 2001 letter to a U.S. Senator, claimed, quote, the Air Force is not conducting any weather modification and has no plans to do so in the future, end quote. However, the existence of the 1996 report, as well as a United States Air Force Special Operations Group called Special Recon, formerly known as Special Operations Weather Team, would seem to contradict the Colonel's statement. In fact, the U.S. military has a history of attempting to control the weather, with varying degrees of success. A program called Project Cirrus was a collaboration between General Electric, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, the Office of Naval Research, and the Air Force, which explored the possibility of weather modification. On October 13, 1947, a B-17 dropped nearly 200 pounds of crushed dry ice into the rain bands of a hurricane moving east out into the Atlantic. The crew of the B-17 reported, quote, pronounced modification of the cloud deck. The hurricane then spontaneously changed direction and started heading west, before making landfall near Savannah, Georgia. The government denied its role in the incident for nearly a decade. Skeptics say that the storm must have already started to turn before the dry ice was introduced, and also point to a hurricane from 1906 that was documented taking a similar course as evidence against the effectiveness of the operation. Weather satellites did not exist at the time, therefore we can't be certain whether the storm began to deviate from its original path before or after the operation. Project Storm Fury was conducted by the U.S. government from 1962 to 1983 and was an attempt to weaken tropical cyclones. This project was a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Commerce, specifically NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with the U.S. Navy. The hypothesis was this: tropical cyclones could be weakened by seeding them with silver iodide, causing supercooled water inside the storm to freeze, thereby disrupting the inner structure of the storm. This hypothesis was eventually proven to be false, and the Navy abandoned the project in the early 1970s. However, the government gained a vast knowledge of tropical storms and further refined cloud seeding techniques. Fidel Castro, communist dictator of Cuba at the time, claimed Operation Storm Fury was in fact an attempt to weaponize hurricanes. While the veracity of Castro's allegation can't be confirmed, there is at least one known example of the United States military attempting to weaponize the weather. Operation Popeye was a highly classified Air Force program during the Vietnam War that did, in fact, successfully control the weather. The operation was carried out from 1967 to 1972 in an attempt to extend the monsoon season over specific areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was accomplished by flying Hercules C-130 and F-4 Phantom aircraft out of Thailand twice per day to seed the clouds over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia with silver iodide in order to produce more rainfall and make the rainy season last longer. The results included larger than average amounts of rainfall and an extension of the monsoon season by 30 to 45 days per year. This led to higher levels of flooding and landslides, resulting in difficulties with enemy logistics, troop movements, and supply lines. Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense under President Kennedy, and at the time an advisor to President Johnson, was aware that the international scientific community would have negative feelings about weather being manipulated for use as a weapon. But he counseled President Johnson that those possible objections shouldn't get in the way of military operations that were deemed to be in the interest of national security. Most likely due to a lack of knowledge of the operation, then current Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird categorically denied the existence of any such program or technology to the United States Congress. Decades later, in 2001, Dennis Kucinich, a congressman from Ohio, introduced House Resolution 2977. It was called the Space Preservation Act of 2001 and would have banned what it called, quote, exotic weaponry from space and Earth's atmosphere. The bill even specifically named chemtrails in the list of weapons it sought to ban. However, that section of the bill was removed before the final version eventually died in Congress. Finally, and perhaps the most intriguing motive alleged by some theorists, is geoengineering. Much like weather control, but on a larger scale, is climate control. This version of the theory proposes that chemtrails are being used in an attempt to mitigate climate change, specifically global warming, by dispersing tiny particles into the atmosphere. These particles are metallic and reflective, reducing the amount of solar radiation and therefore heat that our planet receives from the sun. In attempting to mitigate global climate change, there are negative side effects to the population and environment. Something like a cancer patient receiving chemo and suffering side effects. Global warming is nothing new. It was theorized in 1896 by a Swedish scientist, and modern scientists have been extremely concerned about it since at least the 1950s. The Keith Group, a think tank based at Harvard University, studies the concept of geoengineering through a process called albedo modification, which would use a very similar process to the one described by chemtrail theorists. The group says, however, quote, "We are confident that there is no currently active program to actually test or implement albedo modification outdoors." They add, quote, "We are not now involved in outdoor experimentation, though we are indeed actively developing proposals for field experiments. This experiment will proceed only if it is conducted in a fully transparent manner, and only if it passes a comprehensive safety review. Nonetheless, the technology to alter the Earth's atmosphere with microscopic particles is at least in the development phase. In fact, the United States Navy was granted a patent in 1975 for a device producing, quote, a powder contrail having maximum radiation scattering ability that would be used, quote, to generate contrails or reflective screens for any desired purpose. Keep in mind that sunlight is a form of radiation. Another patent was issued to the Hughes Aircraft Company in 1991. Quote, this invention relates to a method for the reduction of global warming resulting from the greenhouse effect, and in particular, to a method which involves the seeding of the Earth's atmosphere with Welsbach-like materials, end quote. These materials, microscopic, at 10 to 100 microns in diameter, would be made from thorium dioxide and aluminum oxide. The patent suggested that the particles, quote, could be added to the fuel of jet airliners, so that the particles would be emitted from the jet engine exhaust while the airliner is at its cruising altitude. In a May 2000 report, the International Panel on Climate Change concluded a program such as this might succeed in mitigating global warming. Additionally, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory calculated that this method, or one like it, could stop warming over 85% of the globe and would cost $1 billion per year. That would certainly be a small price to pay in comparison to the inconvenience and cost of ditching fossil fuels, an industry with a revenue of $6.7 trillion in 2014 alone. Now that we have explored the possible motives behind the alleged chemtrail conspiracy, let's examine some of the evidence put forth in support of the theory. Eyewitness reports, as well as photos and footage such as what you observe here, are by far the most abundant pieces of evidence offered in support of chemtrails. Believers claim that all you must do is look up to see this evidence. They posit that vapor trails behind jet aircraft used to dissipate quickly, and since sometime in the 1990s persist for far longer. Witnesses also often claim that these chemtrails intersect to form X-shaped or cross-hatched grid patterns in the sky, which, over time, thin and spread out to form sheets of artificial clouds. Some witnesses have claimed to see a prismatic, shimmering, quote, oil and water type effect in the sky. Skeptics might explain this phenomenon as a rainbow, but is it plausible that chemtrail believers could be misidentifying something as commonplace as a rainbow? This seems at least somewhat dubious. Witnesses have often observed vapor trails that break and then continue, such as in this photograph. These individuals interpret this to mean that the spraying was paused or the tanks were switched. Mainstream science, however, would explain this by variances in the atmospheric condition the aircraft is flying through. In the late 1990s, a couple in rural Maine observed 30 different jets streaking across the sky, all leaving chemtrails behind, in a span of only 45 minutes. When they contacted the nearest airport and spoke with a civilian air traffic controller, they were told there had only been a single aircraft in their vicinity during the given time frame. They then contacted the FAA and spoke to an individual higher up the chain of command who told them, off the record, that there had been a military exercise in the area, but would give no further information. Upon contacting the military, they were told quite forcefully that no such exercise had occurred. The staff of a local radio station in the same community claimed to have witnessed an astonishing 370 separate contrails, all visible simultaneously. This is an extreme example of a common assertion among chemtrail believers that vapor trails have increased in number over the years. Air Force Colonel Washbaugh, in the same letter to the U.S. Senate that we mentioned earlier, said that chemtrails were a hoax, and that increased artificial cloud cover was due to, quote, significant civil aviation growth in the past decade. Our research indicates that civil aviation grew by 63% between 1990 and 2000. It has grown by a further 250% between 2000 and 2019. This definitely explains any increase in visible contrails, but still doesn't dismiss the premise of the chemtrail theory. These next two photos may be familiar to chemtrail proponents or anyone who has researched the subject. Some claim these photographs depict equipment used by jets to spray chemicals into the atmosphere. The mainstream explanation holds that this equipment is used to test aircraft capabilities and behavior under various different load capacities during takeoff, flight, and landing situations. While most of the evidence reviewed so far is by nature anecdotal and inconclusive, chemtrail researchers have sought to put forth more solid, scientific evidence at various times, collecting samples of air, soil, and rainwater for analysis. Many of these pieces of evidence have been discounted by skeptics due to the nature in which the samples were collected, handled, or tested. However, in at least one instance, official government testing and subsequent behavior may shed some light on the chemtrail theory. Consider the following series of events. In 1998, residents of a small town in Ontario, Canada, began inexplicably experiencing flu-like symptoms. Frequent asthma attacks, headaches, dizziness, and chronic pain among other symptoms. Residents of the area also reported a massive increase in air traffic, creating artificial cloud cover, coinciding with the unexplained illnesses. They even claimed to have identified United States Air Force jets creating chemtrails. Rainwater falling through a dense concentration of vapor trails in the sky over this area was collected and found to contain levels of aluminum 7 times higher than allowed by government health regulations. The residents sent a petition to the Canadian government demanding answers. The government responded by denying that any program of aerial spraying was taking place, and then ordered its own official tests to be conducted. The results of those tests were never released. For their part, in most instances where government agencies address the chemtrail theory, they unsurprisingly attempt to debunk the conspiracy claims in a fairly straightforward manner. For example, around the year 2000, the United States Air Force listed a disclaimer on its website which stated, quote, "The chemtrail hoax has been investigated and refuted by many established and accredited universities, scientific organizations, and major media publications. Here at the Conspiracy Files, we have no inherent distrust of academia or mainstream science at large. However, we have already demonstrated numerous occasions in which the government and military were caught lying. Therefore, it is perhaps also unsurprising that the results of a Pew Research poll released in 2010 found that nearly 80% of Americans distrust the government, and probably for good reason. A 2020 Gallup poll found that 60% of Americans also distrust the mass media, with 33% indicating that they had no trust at all, alongside 27% who described their trust level as not very much. We point this out only to illustrate the lack of effect such government denials have on quelling the conspiracy theory in the minds of believers. In fact, these denials often seem to have the opposite effect, further strengthening the resolve of chemtrail theorists and even being cited as an additional piece of evidence. Believers of the conspiracy theory often describe their discovery of the theory as being similar to an awakening or a religious experience. They often say things like, "I'll never change my mind about chemtrails, no matter what the evidence is." They wholeheartedly believe the theory to be true, and feel that every man, woman, and child on planet Earth is under attack. This makes them, understandably, very angry. And while much of the evidence is intriguing, even compelling, we must point out that most of it is circumstantial. This is not to say that the evidence is invalid. In fact, people are convicted in criminal courts every day on nothing but circumstantial evidence. Even DNA evidence is technically circumstantial. What direct evidence does exist, in the form of eyewitness testimony, photographs, and video, is not conclusive. The fact that these witnesses see and photograph white lines in the sky, even if they look strange or linger for long periods of time, does not prove the chemtrail theory to be true. So far, there is no infallible, incontrovertible evidence. On the other hand, the mainstream explanations do not prove the chemtrail theory to be false, partially because it is extremely difficult to prove a negative, or in other words, to prove that something is not true. The burden of proof, however, lies with those making the claims. We seem to be left with more questions than answers at this point. However, I think there are 3 important, general questions to be asked when it comes to evaluating this theory. These questions must be answered by each individual after reviewing the available facts and evidence, but we will include our answers here. Those questions are as follows. Could the United States government perpetrate the chemtrail conspiracy, or one like it? Probably. Would the government perpetrate such a conspiracy? Maybe. Is the government doing these things? I can't be sure. In closing, we can't, in good faith, go all in on the chemtrail theory. However, in light of the most compelling evidence available, we can't dismiss it out of hand either. So for now, the chemtrail case remains open in the conspiracy files.